Yes. I just wanted to talk about scientists and matter, because when I watch your videos, and also this morning you stated that they haven't found matter yet. But then I see, for instance, the Large Hadron Collider, where they smash particles at high speeds to find new particles. How would you see that? Because I still don't get that. On a relative level, that there is no matter, or no particles, or like photons who can behave like waves or particles sometimes, scientists say. And how would you say that they haven't found matter on a relative level? That's what I want to grasp.
Can we define matter as everything that takes place outside consciousness? Would that be a reasonable definition of matter?
That would not be my idea, no.
But would it be a reasonable working, provisional definition of matter? Matter is obviously that which is outside mind.
Yeah, my idea would be there would be particles, but the only way...
Okay, but the particles exist outside mind. Because if they exist inside mind, they must be made of mind. So if they're not made of mind, they must exist of something that takes place outside the mind, called matter.
Do you mean the person's mind, or the observer, the scientist, for instance, or
Yeah. Yes.
Well, I would think that we only have our senses to observe a certain reality outside the person. So a scientist can only see, hear, smell, touch, or so that's limited. So that I understand, but
so you understand that the scientists, or the mind of the scientist, or whatever that mind experiences, takes place inside that mind. For instance, your perception of this room is now appearing inside your mind. Have you ever experienced anything that didn't take place inside your mind? Or let's say inside consciousness.
No, I haven't.
Has anybody ever experienced anything that didn't take place inside consciousness?
It's always in their mind, no, not outside of their mind, or no.
So would you agree that our culture makes a huge leap of faith in believing that there is something outside consciousness, and that's called matter. The stuff that supposedly exists outside consciousness is what we call matter. Stuff that is not mind or not consciousness. You acknowledge that neither you nor anybody has ever or could ever experience such a thing. And yet most of us believe there is such a thing. Moreover, not only do we believe there is such a thing as matter, we believe that our own mind is derived from it. In other words, we believe that the only thing that is ever experienced is derived from the only thing that is never experienced. I mean...
Yeah, I get that part. But still, now the classic example is you're on the pavement, you see a car coming, you're not going to cross the street.
But exactly the same is true when you're dreaming. When you're having a dream, you don't cross the street. Why? Because if the car hits you, it's going to hurt. It's true in the dream, but that doesn't prove or even imply that the car exists outside consciousness. Yes, if you cross the road, the car will hit you and it will hurt, whether you do it in the waking state or in the dream state.
But if I just suppose I don't see the car coming, I'm distracted. I don't see the car. It's not in my mind. I'm not conscious of it. I cross the street, bam, I get killed. So.
Well, then you usually wake up in the dream and realize that it was all in your mind.
Yeah. Yeah, I still.
I understand where you're coming from. You see, the scientists. It's not just scientists. I like scientists, by the way, very much. It's our culture in general, but science in particular uses the fact that we all experience the same world as evidence that there is a world outside consciousness. These flowers are appearing to 100 different minds at the moment.
Yeah, I get that part, because when we always say these flowers are red, and someone else is saying, and that sort of confirms our perception that flower is red, while colors don't really exist. It's the way.
No, I wasn't. I was just going to say the fact that the flowers exist, that the fact that the flowers are appearing to 100 different minds. If one of those minds would leave the room, the flowers would continue to exist and continue to be perceived. And from this, our culture in general draws the conclusion that therefore the flowers must exist outside the mind, because when one mind leaves, or two minds leave, or three minds leave, the flowers still remain. This is the argument that our culture uses to prove the existence of a world outside consciousness. But there is another interpretation of the same fact. The same fact, the fact being that we are all experiencing the flowers. Now, if each of our minds were precipitated within and made of the same field of infinite consciousness, then each of our minds would be informed by the same field of consciousness. And therefore it is not surprising that parts of each of our mind are shared, like two circles that are overlapping. Part of the contents of the two circles are shared, and part of the concept, part of the circles that are not shared, that are not overlapping, their contents are not shared. So the consciousness-only model can explain the agreement we all have about the nature of the world, but without appealing to something outside consciousness. The fact that we all experience the same world is because each of our minds is informed by and appears in the same consciousness. It is the sameness of consciousness that gives rise to our feeling of the same world.
So if we all left the room and the flowers are on the table, what would the status be of the flowers? How would you?
Well,
no one can be sure there are flowers anymore, because no minds.
But what I'm not saying is that all there is to consciousness is the content of our waking state mind. We all know from our personal experience that there is much more to our own mind than simply the contents of the waking state. When we fall, in fact, the waking state is the narrowest segment of our mind. If you fall asleep and dream, or if you take ayahuasca, or if you meditate, the focus of the mind relaxes, and as a result, its spectrum broadens. So there is much more to mind than the waking state. So I am not suggesting that all there is the content of each of our minds. I'm painting a picture of an entire field of consciousness, which, when at rest, has no form within itself. But when it starts to move within itself, that movement gives its own presence an amplitude and a frequency. In other words, its formlessness begins to take form as it begins to vibrate within itself. And I'm suggesting that each of our minds are a window onto that infinite consciousness. Each of our minds are, as it were, the agency or the vehicle through which infinite consciousness is able to see itself as the world.
So our minds would be like personal computers sort of logging into a network of consciousness.
You could say that, yes. So there is very much more available on the network than you are able to see on your computer. So I'm not saying that all there is in consciousness is simply the sum total of our waking state minds. Our waking state minds are just temporary windows onto this infinite field. And that explains the reason why we all share the same world without appealing to something outside consciousness. Why is it not legitimate to appeal to anything outside consciousness? Simply because nobody has ever or could ever find that stuff. The belief in a world made of matter outside consciousness is just a belief. It is a conditioning. Nobody has ever found it. It is just a way of thinking. It's like thinking the earth is flat or the sun goes round the earth. It is just a way of thinking that we have all, as a society, bought into as the most plausible reason for our experience of a shared world. It is an interpretation, not a fact. If we stay very close to the facts of our experience, we never find or could ever find stuff outside consciousness. And it's not necessary. All the laws of physics, as we now know them, can be explained as laws of mind, laws of the that govern the activity of mind, rather than laws that govern the substance called matter. So I'm not dismissing 2,000 years of science. I'm just upgrading the science of matter to the science of mind. I use mind and consciousness synonymously in this context.
Yeah, my idea was mind as a personal mind and consciousness.
That's true. That's the way I normally use it. But in this conversation, I'm using the words. Yeah, you're right. I should be consistent. When I say mind, I usually mean each of our finite minds. When I speak of consciousness, I mean that the field in which each of our finite minds appears.
Yes, because I got the fact that it wouldn't exist outside consciousness as the total field of consciousness, and that I get. Yeah,
yes.
Can't exist outside of that.
Why does the world appear to us in a way that is consistent with classical physics? Why does the world appear to us as stuff made out of matter, that is, stuff made out of something other than consciousness? It's because go back to the dream world. When you have a dream at night, you fall asleep to your own mind. You dream a world within your own mind, but you have to view the dream world from the point of view of someone in that world. In other words, when you're viewing the dream world, you don't think, I am a person asleep in bed, dreaming of this dream world. You feel, I am a very real person on the streets of Amsterdam, viewing what doesn't seem to be a dreamed world, but what seems to be a very real world. So duality, this relationship between the subject that perceives and the world that perceives, is inherent in manifestation. That's the way manifestation is known. It is always known in subject-object relationship. And the object, by definition, has to appear as something other than the subject. So the subject knows itself as I, the mind. Therefore the world, the object, has to appear to be something other than mind. It has to appear as matter. It has to appear as everything mind is not. Mind is empty, transparent, luminous. So the object has to appear concrete, solid, temporary. So that is why even in a dream, which we know is only made of mind, the world we experience is made out of something, and it actually feels, it appears and feels to be solid. Even in the dream, as you say, you step out in front of a car on the road in a dream, and it hits you and it hurts. One solid object hits another object. That's the way the dream world has to appear to the separate subject that knows it. And that's why this world appears in accordance with classical physics. It appears in a classical way to us.
That's exactly the point where I can't follow you anymore, is where I see that there's, to me, the awareness is no longer created by or linked to matter. That I get. There's just consciousness, because the more I examine it, in fact, that confirms in my experience, it's like that. but I just don't get why there can't be matter that is observed within consciousness, that exists in consciousness, that is seen by consciousness.
What would the essential nature? Let's visualize consciousness as a vast, open, empty field. Add a space-like quality to consciousness. In fact, it has no dimensions. But imagine this vast space-like field of consciousness, which is the primary element of experience, which is true of our experience. Consciousness is to be aware is our primary experience. Now, everything that appears, everything that is experienced appears in consciousness, yes? Now, what would it be made of? Have you ever had an experience of something being taken from outside consciousness and placed inside consciousness? For instance, when you have a thought, does that thought come from outside consciousness and it's then placed in consciousness, or does it arise within consciousness?
It arises within consciousness. But a thought is non-material.
What about your perception of this room? Would you agree now that the perception of this room is appearing in consciousness?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Did you have an experience before you had your current perception? Were you aware of the current perception outside consciousness that subsequently appeared in consciousness, or did the perception arise within consciousness?
In consciousness.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you agree that all experience arises within consciousness.
Yes.
Nothing comes from outside. In fact, we don't know that there is an outside of consciousness. Now, prior to any thought or perception, what is there in consciousness other than itself? Prior to any object in consciousness, what is there in consciousness?
In a way, everything?
No, nothing.
Nothing or everything, I would say.
Everything in
Depending
potential. Everything in potential. When there are no clouds in the sky is empty, but all the clouds exist in potential in the sky.
The potential for everything to
the potential for everything, but nothing has yet taken form. Yeah, there is just the empty abyss. Now, when forms start to appear in consciousness, what are they made of? They can only be made of the stuff that is already present in consciousness. What is that stuff?
I know you were saying that it's awareness.
But it's only consciousness.
But then it's the word stuff. You say, what's the stuff it's made of? And yeah, I still get stuck in that view that it's stuff within consciousness.
Well, it's stuff within consciousness, but it's not within consciousness like objects in the space of this room. It's more like images on a screen. An object in the space of this room, relatively speaking, is made out of something different from the space. Relatively speaking, this glass is made out of matter and the space is empty. Forget that model. It's used in the early stages of the non-dual teaching, but it's a very limited. Replace that metaphor with the screen and the image. The self-aware screen and the image. Whatever appears on the screen doesn't just appear on the screen, it is made of the screen. All there is to the landscape in the movie is the screen itself. Now, all there is to your thoughts is the knowing of them, yes? That knowing is consciousness. All there is to your perceptions is the knowing of them. Yeah? That knowing is consciousness. In other words, all you have ever known is knowing or consciousness, and you are the consciousness that knows it. In other words, you, consciousness, have only ever experienced yourself. To assert anything other than consciousness requires a leap of faith, which is akin to religion. In fact, it is the religion of materialism. Has anyone here ever experienced anything other than the knowing of their experience? No, of course not. You have? Okay, we'll come to you in a minute.
Well, I rest my case.
We have an objection.